In the 1990s, Georgia went to war with itself. Newly independent from the Soviet Union, celebrations were in order. But less than a year later, Georgian blood would spill in the streets at the hand of their fellow citizens. And it all boiled down to pride and perspectives, and perhaps Russian meddling. But how did this country go from being full of hope to hell on earth? Now, if you watched my video on Marab Mendiashvili, you already have an idea just how bad the situation was in Georgia at this time. But that was only the beginning. Less than a year after his death, a group of Georgians launched a coup on their first post-Soviet democratically elected president, Zviad Gamsakhurdia. And this resulted in him fleeing the country and over a decade of terror for the Georgian people. You see, Georgia was terribly close to completely failing as a state. And to this day, the current situation echoes elements of the same period and ones before. But what would lead a people to do this? And what would lead others to resist even when it cost them their lives? It's April 9th, 1991. Georgia has just celebrated its vote to separate from the crumbling Soviet Union and made Zviad Gamsakhurdia their president. As a newly free nation, excitement was resonant, but with this came the human element of perspective, views, ideas about how people should be governed, and this caused catastrophic problems. Yet these tensions and personal dynamics had already been present, so it was only a matter of time before the lid completely boiled over. And it would do you a disservice to not provide context and a clear picture of the players in this particular story. So we'll go over it briefly before going over what actually happened. Zviad Gamsakhurdia, the first democratically elected president of post-Soviet Georgia. He was eventually overthrown. Jaba Ioseliani, a writer, a thief-in-law, and the founder of the armed paramilitary group Mekhedrioni. He was arrested by Gamsakhurdia and eventually participated in his overthrow. Tengiz Segua, formerly a close ally of Gamsakhurdia and a minister in the Georgian parliament, he eventually resigned and became an enemy of Gamsakhurdia. Tengiz Kitovani, he was appointed commander of the Georgian National Guard by Gamsakhurdia, but even he eventually became an enemy of Gamsakhurdia. Edward Shevardnadze, a Soviet and Georgian politician who was the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1985 to 1991. He was a close ally of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, and was eventually brought back after Gamsakhurdia's overthrow to lead the country. Georgy Gia Kakarishvili, a Georgian military commander and politician and former member of the Georgian National Guard. Zhokhar Dudayev, the first president of the self-declared Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Zviadists, supporters of Gamsakhurdia, largely found in western Georgia, where Gamsakhurdia is from. Anti-Zviadists, the opposition of Gamsakhurdia, believing he had become authoritarian. They were led by Ioseliani and his Mekhedrioni, Kitovani and his National Guard, and Segua. And lastly, Sisino Sitso Kevkishvili, the first casualty of the Tbilisi Civil War. Now that we know the people involved in this story, let's go over what actually happened during those tense 2 weeks. It's the early morning of December 22nd, 1991. In the silence of downtown Tbilisi, before the neighborhood has fully awoken, tanks move in on the Parliament building. No one knows that all hell is about to break loose, except the ones determined to bring it. They get into position and wait. Then comes the command. Georgy Karkarishvili releases rockets at the building and bullets go flying. The Tbilisi Civil War is on. But how did we get here? Let's jump back a few years to 1989 and it'll all make a lot more sense. 1989 is the year Jaba Ioseliani created his paramilitary group Mekhedrioni. Ioseliani was connected to multiple groups in society, remember? As a writer, he had the Intelligentsia Connect, and as a thief-in-law, He has connections to the well-funded underworld. Additionally, there was tension and hostility growing between Georgians and the minority ethnic groups in regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia requiring intervention. Furthermore, there was growing resentment and resistance to the USSR in Georgia. Due to all these factors aligning, Saliani was able to capitalize on the moment and establish his armed group as a, seemingly, socially legitimate group, allowing them to rise to power quickly. The Mkhedrioni were valuable to some and a threat to others, as they could offer enforcement strength, armed protection, and thus political power. Gamsakuria, although he was also anti-Soviet like them, did not agree with their tactics and composition. So, in February 1991, he had Saliani and about 30 other members of the Mkhedrioni arrested for illegally arming a group of people as a militia. Now that's enemy number one. The next month, Gamsakuria is elected president and Georgia votes itself into independence. The Georgia National Guard had been formed a few months before, on December 20th, 1990. And Tengen Kitovani was appointed commander of them by Gamsakuria himself. Things seemed fine, but that simply wasn't the case. Numerous disagreements and tit-for-tats occurred throughout the first few months of independence over how Georgia should be run. But just 4 months after the elections, the tensions hit an accelerated state in which words became fewer and actions more frequent. On August 18th, Segua and 3 other ministers in parliament resigned from their posts in opposition to Gamsakuria's leadership. They denounced him as a totalitarian demagogue and joined his growing list of enemies. The very next day, the Soviets attempted their own coup of then leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, at his vacation home in Crimea. During this coup, the USSR's Deputy Minister of Defense, Vladimir Mikhailovich Shuralyov, reportedly demanded that Gamsakuria abolish the National Guard or face an attack by the Soviets. It's important to note that the Soviets still had active military bases in Georgia at the time, although the country had declared itself independent. The situation was not clean, boundaries were not clear, and a threat of conflict with the Soviets was a very real possibility, especially considering the Georgians were in an unstable state on multiple fronts already. Right after this, Gamsakuria issued a directive to reorganize the National Guard. This directive brought the Guard under the authority of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, so under Gamsakuria's power, and eliminated Kitovani's position as its commander. And Kitovani was not okay with that. So, in defiance, he took approximately 15,000 troops and moved them north from Tbilisi to Erkoni Gorge, dividing the country's official armed force into opposing factions. As the National Guard was under the command of their immediate leaders, their loyalty went to them and not the president. Gamsakuria now had another powerful enemy on his hands. However, he refused to admit defeat. The country was officially divided, and the opposition had fighters, the criminal world, weapons, and personal issues with their president. And the Mkhedrioni didn't go anywhere either. They teamed up with Kitovani, his guardsmen in Segua, and hatched a plot to overthrow Gamsakuria on December 20th, 1991, exactly 1 year after the formation of the National Guard and Kitovani's appointment by Gamsakuria to the position of commander. Kitovani and the opposition demanded he resign, but again he refused. And 2 days later, downtown Tbilisi was a war zone. When the fighting broke out, members of the Mkhedrioni outpowered the guards at the prison, holding their leader, Saliani, broke him out and brought him to join the fight happening in downtown downtown Tbilisi. Sigua had set up the opposition's command post inside Hotel Tbilisi, just 250 meters from the parliament building. They took up sniper positions and were armed with rockets, RPGs, machine guns, and tanks. Civilians who couldn't escape were holed up in homes and basements during the entirety of the fight. Gamsakuria and his people retreated to the bunker inside the building for over 2 weeks as their defense dwindled by the hour. Still, he wouldn't give in to their demands. His family was eventually brought to the bunker to join him after being held at their residence when the fight broke out. Georgia was now officially at war, civil war. Instead of the normal holiday celebrations, the sky was lit up with smoke, and the debris of destruction rained all around. With the lack of resources to continue the resistance, Gamsakuria, his family, and members of his government fled to Azerbaijan through an exit intentionally left open by the opposition in 2 armored cars and 3 buses. The elected government, not even a year old, was now in exile. With this defeat, the opposition set up their interim government, the Military Council, composed of the Big Three. This wasn't a bloodless coup, though. Between 100 to 200 people died during this war, and hundreds others were injured. The first casualty was Sisino Sitso Kevkishvili, a civilian. Zviadist insurgencies began cropping up, largely in western Georgia, and the interim government fought to quell them. And although the oppositional leaders and Zviadists were both anti-Soviet, the opposition ended up bringing Edward Shevardnadze, a former Soviet politician, back to Georgia to lead the country. Soon after, the Georgian-Abkhazian War popped off, leading to yet another horror show, the effects of which are still visible to this day. Gamsakuria initially was denied asylum in Azerbaijan, received a short-term approval to stay in Armenia, and ultimately was granted asylum in Chechnya. He died under debated circumstances the following year, on December 31st, 1992, in western Georgia. He never ceded defeat. Additionally, the former Hotel Tbilisi is now the Tbilisi Marriott Hotel on Rustaveli Ave. The governmental affairs that followed for the remainder of the decade did not go well and would mark this period as a dark and traumatic time in the country's history. This war was the result of different perspectives. Gamsakuria argued that he was reorganizing the National Guard to protect it from Soviet coup forces attacking it as an illegal militia. Additionally, he believed that allowing armed militias to exist that did not answer to the government but their own command was a recipe for disaster, especially for a newly independent nation trying to get its footing. The opposition argued that Gamsakuria was doing it for personal power and as capitulation to Moscow. And for this reason, in their own personal encounters with him, they deemed him unfit to lead and accused him of moving toward authoritarianism. The moves he made would strengthen the central government and weaken the power that they had at the time. And years later, modern historians argued that Gamsakuria used those opportunities to neutralize powerful rivals. Today, Georgia is definitely calmer than it was 30 years ago. However, there's another crisis that has cropped up amongst them. The current party in power, Georgian Dream, is being met with opposition. They suspended EU talks until 2028, are claiming that some protesters are being funded by foreign actors, including Georgian citizens who have immigrated to other countries, and that they won the elections legally. The opposition is demanding new elections, claiming that the 2024 ones were stolen, that the Georgian Dream Party is imposing a restrictive Russian-style law on the country, and physically harming its people. Although elements of the current situation are echoing the past, many hope that it doesn't end up mirroring it. Georgia has strong and resolute people. Again and again, they've shown that there are qualities within them that preserve their identity through every trial. Steel is forged by fire, but fire still burns, and it can still destroy and leave painful reminders that never fade. One of these reminders is from an event that occurred right after the Tbilisi Civil War in 1992. It was then that almost an entire family was massacred by none other than the people associated with the Mkhedrioni.